And standing at the front of the room had a name that people in Silicon Valley said with a kind of reverence usually reserved for landmarks. Harlan Voss, 41 years of age, lead architect at Meridian Systems, the kind of company whose logo appeared in the corner of software used by hospitals, banks, and 3 different branches of the federal government. When Harlan Voss walked into a room, people noticed, not because he was tall or loud or dressed in anything remarkable, but because he carried the particular silence of someone who had already solved the problem everyone else was still arguing about. That morning, he was not walking into his own room. He was being interviewed. The conference room on the 14th floor of Caldwell-Pryce Technologies smelled like new carpet and old ambition. The chairs were expensive. The view of downtown Chicago was the kind that companies put in recruiting videos, and seated across the long glass table were 3 men who had spent the last 11 minutes pretending to read Harlan's resume while actually studying his face. The broadness of his nose, the way he kept his hands folded and still, the slight accent that crept in when he said certain words. The accent that came from 17 years in Accra before his family moved to Cincinnati when he was 14. The man in the center was named Brett Caldwell, not the Caldwell of Caldwell-Pryce, that was his uncle, but close enough that his business card carried the name like a birthright. Brett had the particular confidence of someone who had never once been made to feel out of place in a room he wanted to be in. He was 34. He had an MBA from Wharton and a squash habit and the kind of laugh that filled spaces without warming them. To Brett's left sat Owen Price III, Owen III, as the junior staff called him behind his back. Owen III was quieter than Brett, but somehow colder. He had spent 12 years building Caldwell-Pryce's security architecture and considered himself the only person in the building who truly understood what the systems were doing underneath. He was not wrong exactly, but he was also not as right as he believed. The third man on Brett's right was a senior vice president named Leonard Ashby. Leonard was the one who had actually recruited Harlan, had called him on a Thursday afternoon 8 weeks ago, and spent 40 minutes on the phone explaining why Meridian's loss would be Caldwell-Pryce's gain. Leonard was also the only person in that room who seemed genuinely curious about what Harlan might say. "So," Brett said, setting down the resume in a way that suggested he hadn't needed to pick it up in the first place. "Meridian. Good shop. Mid-tier, obviously, but solid foundational work." Harlan said nothing. "The reason we brought you in," Brett continued, "is that we're rebuilding our core verification layer, the whole thing, ground up. Owen's been leading the preliminary design, but we want a second set of eyes before we commit to the architecture." He said second set of eyes, the way someone says second opinion when they've already made up their mind but want the appearance of due diligence. Owen III slid a printed document across the table. 40 pages, dense with system diagrams and technical specifications. Harlan picked it up. He did not flip through it quickly the way people do when they want to seem like they're reading fast. He started at page 1. He read. The room had the particular discomfort of 3 men watching a 4th man do something they couldn't rush. Brett filled the silence. "We're projecting a full rebuild in 18 months. Owen's design handles about 90% of the load case scenarios. The remaining 10% we flagged as edge cases will address in version 2. Harlan turned a page. "The market timeline is the constraint," Brett said. "We have a contract with the Department of Transportation that requires Phase 1 delivery in 14 months. Owen's team can hit that. The question is whether we need additional architecture oversight, which is where someone like you might." "This won't work," Harlan said. He said it the way people say things that are simply true, not confrontationally, not loudly, the way you say it's raining when someone asks if they need an umbrella. Brett's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it shifted. "I'm sorry?" Harlan placed the document on the table and turned to page 23. He pointed to a diagram near the top of the page, a branching verification sequence, color-coded in blue and orange. "This node," he said, "the fallback authentication loop. Under normal load, it functions fine, but in a concurrent access scenario with more than 800 simultaneous verification requests, the loop creates a recursive dependency. It doesn't fail loudly, it degrades. The system will appear to be running correctly while processing time climbs. By the time anyone notices, you have a 14-hour backlog and a federal contract in breach. Owen 3 said very quietly, "That scenario doesn't appear in our load modeling." "No," Harlan agreed. "It wouldn't. Not with standard modeling tools. The dependency only surfaces if you're testing across three specific conditions simultaneously: peak load, partial server failover, and a particular timing pattern in the request queue. It's an uncommon combination, but the Department of Transportation Systems have exactly that pattern during morning rush across three major corridors." Silence. Owen 3 picked up the document. Brett looked at Leonard, then back at Harlan. He smiled the smile of someone recalibrating. "You've had 40 minutes with this document." 37, Harlan said. "Right." Brett leaned back. "Look, I think what you're describing is a theoretical edge case that our team can. Your contract specifies uptime requirements of 99.97%, Harlan said. The scenario I described would breach that threshold during any of 412 morning windows in your first deployment year. I can show you the calculation if you like." No one asked him to show the calculation. What people who weren't in that room could not have understood is what the silence felt like. It was not the silence of people considering a new idea. It was the silence of people who had been told something they already knew was possible, but had chosen not to look for because looking for it would have meant slowing down, and slowing down would have cost Brett Caldwell something he was not willing to cost. Harlan had seen this silence before. He had grown up inside it, in different shapes. It was the silence of the guidance counselor at Westwood High in Cincinnati, who had suggested, very gently, that Harlan might want to consider technical trade programs rather than university applications. This was 2 weeks after Harlan had scored highest in the state on the AP Computer Science exam. It was the silence of the first venture capital presentation he had sat in on at Meridian, where three partners had spent 40 minutes directing questions to his white colleague while Harlan sat next to the slide deck he had built. It was a silence he had learned not to fill. "I'd like to see that calculation," Leonard said. Owen 3 looked at Leonard. Brett looked at the table. Harlan pulled a legal pad from the bag at his feet. He had brought it without knowing he would need it. Some part of him, the part trained by 17 years of being underestimated, had known. He wrote for 6 minutes. The room watched. At one point, Brett's phone buzzed and he silenced it without looking at it, which was the most remarkable thing Brett Caldwell did that entire day. When Harlan turned the legal pad around, Owen 3 leaned forward. He read the lines of equations slowly, the way you read something you are hoping to find an error in. His jaw moved slightly. He turned the pad sideways. He read it again. "The timing coefficient," Owen 3 said finally. "You're using a non-standard interval model." "I'm using the actual interval pattern from the DOT's public traffic data," Harlan said. "It's in their annual infrastructure report, page 88. Another silence. Then Owen 3 said something that required, for him, more than people would appreciate. "He's right." Brett stood up. This was the move of a man who needed to be in a different position. He walked to the window and looked at Chicago for a moment, as if the city owed him an explanation. "So what's the fix?" he said. It was not quite a question. Harlan had been thinking about the fix since page 23. He had also been thinking, in the part of his mind that ran in parallel, about a theorem he had worked out during a 3-day flight delay in O'Hare 18 months ago, a framework for verification load distribution that his manager at Meridian had called interesting but probably unnecessary. He had never published it. He had never shown it to anyone. He had simply kept it in a notebook because he was the kind of man who kept things in notebooks. He explained it now. Not the whole thing. The room wasn't ready for the whole thing. But enough. A restructured loop architecture. A conditional failover that accounted for the specific timing asymmetry he had identified. The removal of 2 redundant nodes that Owen 3 had included because removing them felt risky, when in fact they were the risk. Owen 3 was taking notes. Leonard was recording on his phone with Harlan's permission. Brett Caldwell had turned back from the window and was now sitting on the edge of the conference table, which was a posture he had never once adopted in a professional setting, because it was the posture of someone listening. The meeting that had been scheduled for 45 minutes ran for 2 hours and 18 minutes. When it ended, Brett walked Harlan to the elevator with a different quality of attention than the one he had arrived with, the attention of a man who had realized somewhere in the last 2 hours that he had almost made a very expensive mistake. At the elevator, he put out his hand. "We'll be in touch this week," he said. "I know," Harlan said. It was not arrogance. It was simply the knowledge of a man who had just solved, on a legal pad, a problem that 14 engineers with access to proprietary modeling software had not found in 6 months of work. It was the tone of someone who has spent a lifetime carrying the answer to questions rooms full of people were afraid to ask. The elevator came. Harlan stepped in. Brett stood in the hallway for a moment after the doors closed, and if anyone had been watching, really watching, they might have seen the particular expression of a man doing the arithmetic of the last hour and not entirely liking what the total came to. 3 days later, Leonard called. The offer was not what Leonard had initially proposed on the phone 8 weeks ago. It was significantly higher. The title was different too. Not architecture oversight consultant, but chief systems architect, a title that came with a seat on the technical steering committee and direct access to the contract management team. Harlan accepted on a Tuesday morning from his kitchen in Evanston, while his coffee went cold because he'd been on the call longer than expected. He started at Caldwell-Pryce on a Monday. He wore the same kind of clothes he had worn to the interview. Neat, nothing remarkable, the kind of clothes that made people focus on what you said instead of what you were wearing. He was given an office on the 12th floor with a glass wall and a view that was not quite as good as the 14th, but better than nothing. 0-3 came by on the first afternoon. He stood in the doorway for a moment, in the way of a man who had rehearsed something and was deciding whether to say it. "The framework you described," Owen said. "The conditional failover structure. I've been working through the math." "And there's a generalization in it," 0-3 said carefully. "If you extend the timing asymmetry model beyond the binary failover case to an n-tier distribution, you get something that could apply across the entire class of recursive verification problems. Not just this system, any system in this architecture family." Harlan looked at him. "I know," Harlan said. He had known for 18 months. He had known it sitting in a plastic chair at O'Hare, watching a departure board flip from delayed to delayed while the rest of the terminal moved around him with the furious purposelessness of people who cannot sit still when things aren't going the way they planned. 0-3 stepped inside the office. For the first time, he looked like a man who wanted to talk about something rather than defend something. "Have you written it up?" "Some of it," Harlan said. "I'd like to see it, if you're willing." Harlan picked up a notebook from the box of things he was still unpacking, a black-covered Moleskine, worn at the corners, the pages full of the kind of handwriting that only makes sense to the person who wrote it. He held it for a moment. This was the object that contained 18 months of thinking that no one had asked him to do, that no one had funded or acknowledged or considered necessary. The kind of thinking that happens in the margins of a career spent proving to rooms of people that you belong in them. He handed it to 0-3. 0-3 took it with both hands. Neither of them said anything about what it meant, Harlan handing it over, 0-3 receiving it. But in rooms where things like this happen, the words aren't the thing. The thing is the gesture, the acknowledgement that arrives not as an apology and not as a speech, but as a man standing in a doorway, having done the math, coming to find the person who did it first. Harlan went back to unpacking his box. On his desk, under a stack of technical documents he had brought from Meridian, was a single photograph, his mother, standing in front of a house in Accra, squinting into afternoon sun, holding a report card that Harlan had brought home when he was 11 years old. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking at the card. Her expression was one he had never quite been able to name. Not pride exactly, or not only pride, something more like recognition. Like she had always known this was in him, and was simply pleased to see it confirmed. He propped the photograph against his monitor. The framework he had written in a departure lounge at O'Hare, the one that 0-3 was now carrying out of the room under his arm, the one that the engineers at Caldwell-Pryce would spend the next 4 months implementing across every verification system in the company's architecture. It was later published in a systems engineering journal under both their names. 0-3 had insisted. Harlan had not expected that. Maybe that was the thing he carried with him out of that year. The thing that sat next to the satisfaction of being right and the exhaustion of having to prove it yet again in a room full of people who could not see him until they could not ignore him. That sometimes, in the space between being dismissed and being heard, something shifts. Not in you. You were always what you were, but in the room, in the people. In the way a man who spent 12 years building something can stand in a doorway and choose, finally, to learn something instead. The question is not whether Harlan Voss deserved to be in that room. The question is, how many rooms like that one have turned someone like him away before he could open the notebook? I keep thinking about that legal pad. Not the equations on it, though those matter, and we'll get to that, but the fact that Harlan brought it without knowing he would need it. That detail gets me every time. He walked into a room designed to evaluate him, carrying a blank page, because some part of him had already learned what rooms like that tend to require. That's not luck. That's a man who has been underestimated so many times that preparedness became instinct. I've sat in rooms like that one. Maybe not on the 14th floor of a glass-walled building in Chicago, but the architecture is the same everywhere. The slight pause before they say your name, the way the resume gets picked up and set back down, the questions directed past you to someone who looks more like what they expected. You learn to read that room fast. And the thing I've noticed in watching people like Harlan navigate it is that the ones who come out the other side are just the smartest people in the room. They're the ones who stayed honest. Harlan could have let the flaw go. He'd read 40 pages in 37 minutes, identified something 14 engineers missed in 6 months, and nobody in that room was asking him to save them from themselves. He could have sat back, answered the questions they prepared, collected the offer, and said nothing. Plenty of people would have. Instead, he said, plainly, "This won't work." And then he showed them why. That's the thing about integrity that nobody tells you when you're young. It's expensive in the short term. It costs you comfort. It costs you the easy path. Harlan could have walked into Caldwell-Pryce as a quiet hire, kept his notebook closed, done his work without the friction. He chose the friction because the truth was the truth, and the system was going to fail, and he knew it. That's a moral choice as much as a technical one. And then there's 0-3, standing in the doorway at the end. I think about him too. 12 years building something, only to have a stranger with a legal pad identify what you missed in under an hour. That's a hard thing to absorb. The easy response, the human response, is to defend the work, to find the flaw in the flaw. 0-3 did the math instead, and when the math told him he was wrong, he said so, and then he came back the next day to learn. That took something. A different kind of character than the one that built the system, but no less important. What I've come to believe from stories like this one is that these three things move together whether we plan them to or not. The willingness to do what's right even when it costs you. The discipline to keep building your mind in the margins, and the departure lounges in the years when nobody is paying attention. And the refusal to quit when the room is cold and the resume is on the table face down, and the man across from you has already decided. Take one of those things away, and the story ends differently. Harlan without the notebook is just a man who spotted a problem. Harlan without the integrity is just a man who let it pass. Harlan without the years of staying in it, studying, preparing for rooms that hadn't invited him yet. He's not in that conference room at all. The notebook existed because no one asked him to fill it. That's the part that matters most to me. What you build in the silence when there's no audience and no reward and no guarantee that any of it will ever be useful. That's the thing that either saves you or doesn't when the room finally goes quiet and everyone is waiting to see what you know.